Is living close to your children in old age the path to true happiness, or could it, in fact, lead to greater suffering? Many people believe that as they grow older, the best course of action is to live near their children, to be cared for and surrounded by family. But is this always the right choice? The teachings of Zen and Buddhism suggest otherwise. Gautama Buddha once said, "Attachment leads to suffering." Could it be that, in old age, attachment to family could also be the source of pain? Let us explore this question through the lens of a Zen story, unraveling the deeper layers of why living close to your children in old age could be the biggest mistake of your life. 1. The desire for closeness. An elderly man, having spent his youth and middle years working diligently, raising a family and providing for his children, found himself growing weary as old age crept upon him. His hair turned silver, his body stiffened, and the once endless energy he had now seemed like a distant memory. As the years passed, his children grew up and started their own families, moving to distant places to pursue their careers and dreams. The man found himself alone in a quiet house that once bustled with laughter, arguments, and the daily hum of family life. He began to feel the emptiness of old age creeping into his soul. He thought to himself, "Perhaps it is time to live near my children. They will care for me, and I will not feel so lonely anymore. Isn't it the duty of children to look after their parents in their old age?" So he gathered his belongings and moved to a place not far from one of his children. At first it felt like a dream come true. He was warmly welcomed. His grandchildren ran to greet him, and his children promised they would visit often. He felt that this decision had brought him closer to the love and warmth he had been missing. But little did he know that this very decision would soon begin to unravel the peace he sought. 2. The illusion of happiness. In the first few months, the elderly man was filled with joy. His children visited on weekends, his grandchildren would laugh and play around him, and he felt that his old age would now be peaceful and content. But slowly, subtle changes began to occur, changes that he did not notice at first. The visits from his children became less frequent. His calls to them were often met with responses like, "I'm busy," or "I'll come by later." The grandchildren, once so eager to see him, now had their own activities and interests that kept them occupied. He found himself sitting alone, waiting for someone to call, waiting for someone to visit, waiting for the company he so craved. The happiness he thought would come from living close to his family began to fade. He felt like an outsider in their lives, not quite part of their everyday routines. He realized that, though he lived close to his children, the distance between them had not really shrunk. One day, after another lonely evening, he sat in meditation, contemplating his feelings. He remembered the Buddha's words, "Attachment is the root of suffering." He began to wonder, am I too attached to my children? Have I placed my happiness in their hands, expecting them to fulfill my needs? 3. The weight of expectations. As time went on, the man began to feel a sense of resentment. He had given his entire life to his children, raising them, educating them, and preparing them for the world. Now, in his old age, shouldn't they repay him with care and attention? This expectation weighed heavily on his heart. He could not understand why his children seemed distant, why they did not prioritize him as much as he had hoped. The bitterness grew, and with it his sense of suffering. He often found himself thinking, why did I move here if I am to be left alone? Is this how my old age is meant to be? But one night, during a restless sleep, he dreamt of a wise Zen master. The master said to him, "You are clinging to an idea that your children must fulfill your desires. The more you expect from them, the more you will suffer. True peace does not come from others, it comes from within." When he awoke, the elderly man pondered the words of the master. He realized that he had placed unrealistic expectations on his children. He had assumed that being physically close to them would automatically result in emotional closeness. Yet, even though he lived nearby, their lives were separate from his. He had expected them to fill the void of his loneliness, but was this really their responsibility? 4. The realization of attachment. The more the elderly man meditated on his situation, the more he understood the nature of his suffering. It was not his children's lack of attention that caused his pain. It was his own attachment to them and his belief that they owed him something. In his heart, he had placed his happiness in the hands of his children, forgetting the teachings of detachment that he had once known so well. He had allowed himself to believe that living near them would bring fulfillment. But in truth, it had only deepened his longing for connection and intensified his sense of isolation when that connection did not meet his expectations. He recalled another teaching of Gautama Buddha. Nothing is yours. You cannot hold on to anything. Everything you have is borrowed. His children, too, were not his to possess. They had their own lives, their own families, their own paths. By clinging to them, he was attempting to hold on to something that was not his to control. 5. The dangers of dependence. The elderly man began to see another danger in his situation. By moving close to his children, he had inadvertently become dependent on them. He found himself waiting for them to make time for him, relying on them to bring him happiness and comfort. But in doing so, he had lost his own independence. He had allowed himself to become emotionally dependent on their presence, and when they did not provide the companionship he desired, he felt abandoned. He remembered a story told by a Buddhist monk long ago. In the story, a man carried a heavy sack of grain on his back as he traveled from one village to another. The burden weighed him down, and he complained bitterly about how difficult the journey was. But when someone offered to carry the sack for him, he refused, saying, "If I do not carry this burden myself, I will never build the strength to walk on my own." The elderly man realized that he had been carrying the burden of old age, but instead of building the strength to bear it himself, he had placed it on his children's shoulders. He had expected them to carry his emotional weight, but in doing so, he had weakened his own ability to find peace within. 6. The path to inner peace. It was during a quiet afternoon, as the elderly man sat in meditation under the shade of a tree, that the final realization came to him. He understood that living close to his children had not been the mistake. The mistake had been his attachment to the idea that they were responsible for his happiness. True peace, he realized, comes not from others, but from within oneself. He remembered the Buddhist teaching. Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. His children, no matter how much they loved him, could not provide him with the inner contentment he sought. That could only come from his own heart, from his own ability to let go of expectations, and from embracing the present moment as it was, not as he wished it to be. The man decided to change his perspective. Instead of waiting for his children to visit or call, he began to cultivate a sense of gratitude for the times they did reach out to him. He stopped measuring his happiness by the frequency of their visits, and instead focused on the simple joys of his daily life. The sound of birds in the morning, the warmth of the sun on his skin, the quiet moments of meditation that brought him closer to his own heart. 7. The freedom of letting go. As the elderly man continued on his journey of self-reflection, he felt a profound sense of freedom. By letting go of his attachment to his children, he had released the weight of expectation and the suffering that came with it. He no longer felt the need to control their actions or demand their attention. Instead, he allowed them to live their lives as they chose, while he focused on living his own life with peace and contentment. In time, his children noticed a change in him. They no longer felt the pressure of his expectations, and this led to a more genuine relationship. When they visited, it was not out of obligation, but out of love. The elderly man, having freed himself from the chains of attachment, found that he enjoyed their company even more because he was no longer dependent on it for his happiness. 8. The Lesson of Impermanence. The man's journey brought him back to one of the core teachings of Buddhism, the Lesson of Impermanence. Everything in life is transient. Our youth, our health, our relationships. Clinging to anything, whether it be material possessions or emotional connections, only leads to suffering because all things are bound to change. He understood now that his role as a father had changed. His children were no longer the small, dependent beings they once were. They had grown into adults with their own responsibilities and challenges. By accepting this impermanence, he found peace in the knowledge that change is a natural part of life. His relationship with his children, like all things, had evolved, and clinging to the past or wishing for it to remain the same would only bring him suffering. Gautama Buddha taught, "All compounded things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence." The elderly man took these words to heart and embraced each moment as it came, no longer burdened by expectations or the desire for things to remain unchanged. Conclusion. This story invites us to reflect on our own attachments and expectations. How often do we place our happiness in the hands of others, expecting them to fulfill our needs and desires? We may find ourselves believing that happiness lies outside of us, in the actions of our loved ones, in the circumstances of our lives. But true contentment can only be cultivated from within. By letting go of attachment, we free ourselves from suffering. And by finding peace within ourselves, we can bring a deeper sense of harmony to our relationships. May we all find the strength to seek peace within, to let go of our expectations, and to embrace each moment as it is, free from the chains of attachment.